Hi, welcome to the channel. For those of you who don't know me from the other social media platforms, I'm Lee from L&R Models and I specialise in the recreation of my fantastic customers' houses in miniature. Do you want to see how I made this fantastic Victorian villa in stone? Keep watching and I'll show you the process. It's going to be a long one, so grab yourself a cuppa and let's get down to the workbench and I'll show you how it's done. I'm going to talk you through the process and hopefully you'll learn something. What do you think about the beard? Does it make me look old? I always start my models with a little bit of research and customer supplied photographs, architects' plans if they've got them, and Google Street View. So here I'm using Adobe Illustrator to draw out all the relevant elevations and pieces that I need to create the model. I've had to cobble together some of the elevations based on the photographs to get what I want, but here you can see the detailing, the window design that I've put in there. And with this particular model I wanted to recreate the stone design layout, so what I've done is painstakingly drawn out the stonework, and what I'm going to do is use the Cricut to output the pattern of the stone in an embossing, and you'll see how I do that just in a little bit. I haven't really shown it here, but I also include a separate layer to draw out all the windows, and I'll use the Cricut again to output all those files to help me put the windows together. And then from there I can then start to cut out those output Cricut pieces. This is a full sheet and I'm just going to cut them into more manageable pieces. So as you can see here, this is the shape of the walls with all the stone positions marked into. I've also got the windows cut, and I'm going to cut those windows out. And now with the benefit of hyperlapse, I can now just show you quickly the process going behind cutting out all the files. Now this can be an arduous process, but the aid of the Cricut, it just marks off everywhere that I need to cut. What I'm going to do is cut out all these windows. And I've just cut out a little architectural bevel there. I hope you can just see it on those two windows there. I'll just show you a bit closer. It just gives a nice little architectural feature. And then I'll clean up those openings to get a bit of a neater finish. Then the next thing I'm going to do is texturize the stone, and this involves a little bit of a painstaking process of just nibbling along and carving some detail in with the point of my engraving tool. I'll put a link in the descriptions of the type of tool I use. Now this first piece I've done is a little outhouse building, and what I've done once I've got all the pieces carved and the windows cut out, I'm going to start laying them together so I know how it all goes together. Now each of these sides has a slight mitre angle cut into them, which enables me to get a nice tight joint and allows the corners to look better. So what I'll do is tape them together and then run a bead of super glue along the inside of each join and then fold them together. And I'll use an engineer's set square, a little modelling engineer's set square really, not an engineer's set square, but I'll use a set square to get those corners nice and sharp. And as you can see, it's not really playing here, but you might have just seen a little bit of the masking tape that I used to join them together. And to make it nice and tight, I'll just glue an extra little bit of architectural feature at the top. This is the bit that's going to hold on the guttering, and that can be glued flat using super glue again. We've got a nice little solid box shape to start working with. It takes a little bit of time just to get it to glue together. There you see, we've got a nice solid foundation to work on. And what I can now use is some scrap pieces of Foamex to create some triangular shapes to create the foundations of the roof former. I'm going to do this in really fast. Hyperlink again. It's not hyperlink, is it? Hyperlink is what links two bits of a website together. Hyperlapse, of course, is what I meant, and sometimes it's a really useful tool for getting through all the boring, slow bits. But here we see the final piece. It's not really the final piece, but that's where we got to. We've just glued on some formers that the roof is then going to sit on. It's what's called a hipped roof, this, so we need those little triangles there. Now, looking back at my reference picture on the laptop, you can see there's lots of little dimpled texture in the stone. That corner stone is quite flat, but the texture of the stone around is quite rough. Now what I'm going to do is replicate this with my engineer's scribe and just dot in that texture all over the stonework and just enhance some of those joints. Now as you can see with the magic of hyperlapse again, just going over the whole thing. This takes quite a long time and it's quite therapeutic really. Stone carving is one of my favourite parts of making a model, and just embellishing all the little stone details, carving the mortar joints a little bit deeper in places, and like I said, going over with lots and lots of tiny little dots. Now the cornerstones of this building have a more dressed, smooth appearance, so I've used a piece of masking tape here just to protect those edges. It represents about 2mm, so I've put some masking tape on to keep those nice and flat, and what I'm going to do is just dot in the texture all over the rest of the stone. Now once all the texture has been carved in, I can start adding some little details. I'm using a piece of 1mm Foamex here to create the stone windowsills. One thing I forgot to mention is the rest of the house is made out of 2mm Foamex. I'll show you where we get that. And we've got a little date stone. It says 1809 there, so a rather interesting little feature. And I've made that out of a little bit of Foamex and some styrene sheet. That's been carved from the Cricut. I drew the piece up on Illustrator, or in Illustrator, and carved out the little piece, or cut out the little piece in Foamex, and I'm just going to super glue that in place. And additionally to that, I'm going to glue a couple of little pieces of styrene again, little styrene strip. They're going to be acting as the little bits of support block on the wall there. Again, just super glued in place. Now on this wall elevation here, we've got a little bit of stone embellishment around the corners, around the edges even, and I've made that again with a little sheet of styrene. And once that's glued in place, I can just shave a little bit around the edges just to get without the fuzzy edges, not the fudgy edges, as I was about to say then. Now on this gable end, we've got a similar stone embellishment as previous. I'll just show you the process here. This is a piece I've cut out on the Cricut. It's been made out of 0.25mm styrene. So I'll just put a little bit of super glue with a cocktail stick on the back edge of it. Cocktail stick gives me a lot more accuracy in putting the glue down, so I don't put too much down. And then that can be glued in place, just gently placed in position, or carefully placed in position, so that it neatly matches the edge of the already cut out window frames. In addition to this, excuse my wobbly camera angle, in addition to this we can then just glue on some little embellishments to create more detail. And again, this extra detail is made out from 0.25mm styrene, just free cut by hand. And because this is styrene onto styrene, we can use some solvent adhesive, and I can just paint this on with an old paintbrush. I think this is a toothbrush then. An old paintbrush with small bristles. And further details can then be added with a little bit more plastic strip. These are pre-cut styrene strips that you can just buy off the shelf. Can't remember what thickness they are, these, but they're very, very useful for adding little details. And again, just painting on a little bit of solvent with a paintbrush, and then, whoops, didn't fit properly there. And once it's properly set, we can just trim off with a scalpel blade and push back into place. The last thing to add, of course, is, again, like with the other piece, is a little windowsill made from 1mm Foamex. Again, that's just super glued in place. So once all the carving's done, the windows are cut out, the embellishments are in place, I've now got all my elevations ready to work with. And much the same as I did with the outhouse from earlier, I put all the pieces together using masking tape to get the corners right, and then super glue the edges. And when I say the edges, I mean the seams on the insides. Just run a bead of glue down the insides, and then use some super glue activator spray. Helps set everything in place really well. Now, as you can see, we've got the basic structure of the house starting to take shape, and those corners where the stone meet, we've got the miters cut in. A little bit of super glue can sometimes seep under them, and it makes the edges a little bit thickened out. So we can just embellish those corners with the back end of a scalpel blade. It's quite worthwhile taking the time just to enhance those corners, because that's what makes a real difference. Now moving on, we're going to start looking at the roof shapes, and to do that I'm going to use a piece of 2mm Foamex. This isn't the final roof, it's just the basic structure underneath that's going to hold the roof in place. So I'm going to use a piece of 2mm Foamex, like I've said before, and just glue that on with super glue. Now we need to add some extra bits for the dormers. And again, those are little pieces cut out from scraps of 2mm Foamex, and it's worth just taking some time going all the way around and making sure we've got all our shapes in place. And what I'm going to do is secure those temporarily with some masking tape just to make sure it's in the right place before committing to a final glue. Now, in a rare flipping of the camera angle, you can now see me from the opposite angle, and I'm just cutting out some bay window shapes. Now again, these have been marked off on the Cricut. I'm just finishing the cut off with a scalpel and my little set square. Now once all those are cut out, I can then line them up like everything else. I've actually cut out the corners with a mitre angle just so that they fit together better, and again just run a bead of super glue around the edges to make sure it all glues together. I've used a semi-hexagonal piece as a former. Now jumping ahead a little, we can see I've given the overall model a base coat of Vallejo midstone as a starting point, and just using the hairdryer now to speed up the drying process to enable me to carry on. Jumping ahead now, we can see that I've also painted the outhouse building with the same treatment. You might be able to notice that I've also done the roof. Not going to really talk about that because I came to rip the roof off and start again from this point. But here I'm just adding a little bit of glue to the insides of the windows. I've already added some clear acrylic for the glass, and now I'm just going to glue on some little paper strips to replicate window blinds. And I'll repeat that process all around the bay window just to cover the entire window. And once that's been done, I'll give the bay window the same treatment with Vallejo midstone, just painting over the whole thing with freehand brush strokes. Make sure the whole thing is nicely covered. It does go on quite well to Foamex if you give it a good sanding beforehand. Now on top of this, I realised that the midstone was probably a little bit too dark, so going over the whole thing again now, starting off with the window details, I'm just going over with a light stone. Cover the whole house. I could have used an airbrush, but I prefer to hand paint when it comes to stone, making sure all the textures are covered. Now when all that's been painted, I'm going to look at the windows. The windows I've made, again with the Cricut, I've cut all the shapes out, and I'm very carefully gluing lots of layers together. When I say lots of layers, each window comprises three layers. You've got a base frame, an inner frame where the sash is, and then an outer frame. And I'll assemble all those on my very sticky, very dirty Cricut mat. But I'll paint some polystyrene cement on the inside of the frame there. My hand's very shaky there. Again, I'm using a cocktail stick to apply the glue, just trying to be as careful as possible. And now I can glue that frame very carefully onto the edge of the window. And I'll repeat this process with each and every window that needed for the house. It's very painstaking, but it's worthwhile doing. Closer up now, you can see the sash windows that I've made. Some of them are really small indeed. They're extremely fiddly. It's made up out of 0.25mm styrene sheet. I apologise for the camera shaking there. I'm just trying to get a close-in zoom. Now these are on a Cricut mat which has got a little bit dirty and definitely needs replacing. Now using some super glue, I'm now just going to put some dots very carefully in the back of this outhouse building, and that's going to receive my acrylic sheet for the glass. Now I just carefully press a piece of pre-cut acrylic. Now this can be acetate sheet, or in my case what I like to use is 0.5mm PETG. It's a much shinier plastic, but I'll just press that very carefully in place. Now I like to use double-sided tape too to stick the glass on because it doesn't smear as much, but I was very careful with the super glue in this instance. Now I'm going to replicate that process all the way around the building wherever there are window openings, just gluing the acetate sheet behind the walls. Now once I've got all my windows in place, I can just finish off putting the lighter stone colour on all of the building. I'm just checking there whether the bay window fit, and if obviously of course it does. So it just takes a little bit of time covering the whole building, and I'm just going through in hyperlapse, not hyperlink this time, hyperlapse. There's a lot of painting to be done, and as you can see, a little heart appeared then because I do tend to live stream my work when I do it over on the Tickety Tock. So I'm just making sure the whole thing is covered. Again, you could use an airbrush, and I don't need to mask it off here on hand painting. Now I'm going to add some extra plinth detail. There's a little bit of stone plinth running around the whole building, and I'm going to use 1mm Foamex for this. So just cut some strips out, work my way around the building, For the bay window, I've just got to make sure it all fits. I'm not quite ready to glue the bay window in place at this point. I'm going to paint behind it black so that we get the illusion of depth of the house without actually showing the whole thing. Now as I go around, I have managed to glue it in place now. Just make sure that those plinths go around, and I'm going to cut a slight angle to make sure all those pieces fit together. Now at this point we've got to do a step, so I'll just cut that way around. It doesn't go all the way around the house, so it's a bit of an oddity. And I'll just make sure the whole area is completely covered. Now this one has a little bit of brick detail, so I've just carved it in. Use a piece of sandpaper to rough the edges up, and again just carving a bit more detail in. So once all that's done, I'll match up the colour with the same light coloured paint. And at this point it's time to add a little bit of texture into the stone, so I'm just going to pick a few little lighter shades of stone and medium shades of stone and just touch a few of them in. Now I'm going to come back to this at a later stage, so I only put a few little bits in. Giving it a wash now to pick out those details. I'll go through the whole house and add some little bits of staining into the stone using a darker wash. And again, here we come to the windows, and to create the illusion of depth without completely doing the interior, I just put a little bit of black card, or in this case it's black painted Foamex, behind the walls. That way we get a reflection, a realistic looking reflection through the glass, but also you don't have to do the full interior. It gives a nice shine and an element of depth. Now those window frames can now be added in. These are the ones I've pre-made, and because I've already put the acetate behind the window, these frames can just be slotted inside in place. To glue those in place, just a little bit of white glue. There's a special glue that I use called Glue and Glaze from Deluxe Materials, and that doesn't have very much seepage. It tends to dry very, very clear if you make an accidental smudge. And once all the windows are in place, or not in place as you might be able to see from here, because there's a couple that I left until the last minute, I'm going to put some roof trim on. Again, this is a piece of 2mm Foamex, cut to about 4mm wide I think, and this is just to finish off the edge of the roof space. Now the next stage is to use some strips of extruded plastic. These are half round and flat. I'm going to use these two together to create some guttering. It's quite an ornate Victoria guttering here, and I can super glue that in place all around the roof edges. As you can hopefully see there, we've got a slightly decorative guttering edge achieved by using this strip. Now I'm going to go around the whole edge of the building, including the outhouse, using this same technique. The cork left over from Christmas there is an ideal little prop to hold it all up. Now it takes a little bit of time to get this right, but it's worth doing again, and just making sure it's all the way around the edge. And I'll finish off those gable edges with some 2mm strips. It's actually 4mm I think. Some 4mm strips of 0.25mm styrene, just for those fascia edges. Those edges are then embellished with a tiny strip of 1mm just to finish off the detailing. I'll just go around the roof caps. Now at this point, again, I don't want to say too much about the roof. You can see there's some tiling effect in there. That was my original idea, to use a piece of 1mm Foamex scribed with the tile detail. But when it came to painting, I completely filled it in and started all over again, much the same as I did on this little outhouse. So we're not going to mention the roof just yet. I'm going to talk about that once we get through to that. Still haven't fitted the rest of the windows here on this outhouse, so I'm just going to finish that bit off now. Just sand off the front so it paints better. In fact, I'm not sanding it there. I'm just cleaning off the edges. It's a little bit fuzzy, but again, if they're cut exactly to size, they can just slot right in with a little dab of glue just to hold it in place. Now, if you're a familiar fan of my live streams, you'll know that one of my trademarks is to hide a tiny little ghost behind a certain point in each build. Now, not a lot of people know this, but if you're watching this, everybody knows it now, but you can just about see his ghostly little face through the window there. It's just a little bit of one of my things, really, but like I say, it's not really much of a secret now if you're all watching it, but there you go. Now this is the chimney stack. I'm going to make two of these for either end. Again, Foamex carved with the engineer's scribe, and I've just used a little piece of 1mm Foamex on the top to hold it all in place. I'm just going to glue that on with super glue and a little bit of masking tape around the edges for flashing. Now again, like I say, it's a little bit early on because I didn't finish this. I wasn't happy with the roof, so I've started again. But at this point I can add the little eyebrow dormer window. Again, that's fashioned out of some styrene strip to create the shape, and I've glued a little bit of acetate behind for the glass. Now the first thing I'm going to do is just glue it in place. It was rather tricky getting the top of the LED flashing cut, but I decided in the end I was going to cut a notch straight through the window and then cut a piece of styrene to shape and to size. Now you can see that took a lot of cutting, but eventually I got the styrene to fit and it got a nice curve, and once it was in I just cut the excess off with the scalpel blade. And it's not quite finished here yet, but it has produced a rather neat and nice looking eyebrow dormer. Again, just finish that off with a little bit of masking tape and a piece of round rod for the embellishment on top of the roof. I use a lot of masking tape for finishing off the flashing. And now we're going to go back to the stonework. I'm going to take some time and have a little bit of fun painting individual stones. I've chosen a range of colours. You can just see those in the background there. They're from Vallejo, and there's a range of greys, buff colours, tan, and we're just going to give the stone a little bit of character. Now the rear of the house has got a rougher texture and it's a slightly different colour, so I'm going to use a lot more greys, touching up all the way around, and the same with the outhouse there. Again, I'm using the picture for reference. As you can see, there's lots of different tones in the stone, and it's really quite fun going around just filling it all in. If only it was as quick as this in real life. But then again, where would be the fun in going really quickly? Now once all that's done, I'm going to go over with a light grey wash to give it a bit of uniformity and to tie all those colours in together. Also just to give it a bit of age as well. But as you can see, that's sort of being highlighted with all the little stone details. Some of my camera angles weren't great there. Now once that's done, I'm going to touch up the edges with some white paint. It's quite an unusual roof trim here that it's all white rather than a matching grey. So I've just used an off-white to colour all the white bits in. Again, I'm going to go back over this roof again. This isn't my final roof and I'm really disappointed that it didn't work so well, but we'll come to that in a moment. Now it's time to add some mortar, and what I like to do to add the mortar is to use some ready mixed filler. It's actually ready mixed grout filler this, but I'm using a silicone tip from a sculpting tool just to tease it all in. And then once that's in, just work on it a little bit at a time. And then once that's all done, you can just wipe it off with a kitchen towel to get rid of the excess. I'm going to work all my way around the building, doing the same thing. I actually went through 3 silicone tips doing this. It was a cheap silicone moulding kit that the tips broke off. I wasn't very happy with it at all, so I ended up using a paintbrush in the end. It also has the very nice effect of lightening the stonework, so you can just play around with different finishes, but I'm trying to get to a light stone texture. So my paintwork is a bit dark to start off with, but adding the mortar and the light filler just tends to tone the whole thing down to a reasonable level, or a more realistic level. Once all that's done, I can just lightly go over and clean up the stonework, and as you can see, it's produced a really quite effective looking wall. Now with stone, a lot of the work is layers. You have to work with a lot of different layers to get to the texture you eventually want. Now I'm going to go back over with that light grey wash that I used earlier, just going back over all that mortar work. And I know it looks like it's kind of ruining the effect, but basically it's just embellishing the effect. You just keep going backwards and forwards, just keep adding different layers until you're happy. The grey wash gives it a more aged effect and again ties it all together. And now we're going back to that roof that I mentioned. Now my original roof, although it was nice and fine, the painting tended to fill in the gaps, which I didn't like it. So we're going to a different technique now, and I'm using some notched I'm going to use some notched styrene strips. Again, I've cut these out with the Cricut and I'm just going to layer them. I can use the original stone texture, not the original tile texture that I put on, as a guide, and I'm going to glue these strips all over the roof. You'll see when I've done it just what a change it makes. It's quite a time-consuming job is this, which is why again we can have the nice effect of hyperlapse. All those valley gutters, they can be filled in with some masking tape, and just take the time to go around all those little gable ends and dormer windows. So like I say, it's probably about 3 hours worth of work that we're seeing now on the roof. It takes a lot of time just to lay them all up and get the ridges right, the steps right, the overlaps right, and there's a lot of adjusting and cutting. Once that's done, I can give it a wash of grey, and you can see it's a nice tile effect. It's going to take a lot of painting to get that right, but this time I'm using dry brush techniques and washes just to get that roof right. Now, having repeated the same technique on the little outhouse, to create those ridge tiles I'm using a piece of round rod. I'm going to glue that to the ridge of each part, including the hipped parts, and then cover that with some masking tape just to produce the rest of the ridge tile. And that can be now washed with a light grey wash just to build up the colour of the roof in layers. The idea with this now is I don't want to fill in those roof tile details, so I'm just going to go very, very carefully layering over and over again just to get the colour right. Now what I'm doing here is gluing an inside step for the inside of the doorway. It's quite a deep revealing doorway. A deep revealing doorway, what's it going to reveal? It's quite a deep doorway reveal, so we've got an inside step there that I'm just gluing in with a piece of Foamex. And now I can add in some porch details that I've made from styrene sheet. Again, these have been drawn up on the computer and cut out on the Cricut. I've created the shapes and layered them together with some polystyrene cement. The door unit has been made in pretty much the similar way, with a printed piece of paper behind glass to represent the frosted glass effect, and that just neatly clips in place. Jumping ahead now, we're going to look at the base, and for the base I've cut out a piece of MFC. It's actually an offcut of an old door that came from IKEA. I think it cost me £2. It was a faulty or unused piece of door. Thought it would come in handy for a base, and I've covered that with some foam. At the background there you can see some tiles that some stone tiles that I've already made and glued down in place. They are made out of Foamex, carved in place and painted with an initial coat of wash. And for the retaining walls, what I've used are some coffee stirrers to create those little banks of retaining walls. I'm just going over really, really quickly here now. We've got some filler for the landform. I've painted the ground with some dark brown ready to receive the eventual grass. Creating a little driveway here now with some plastic, extruded plastic. It's in the shape of some herringbone stone to create that stone effect. I just need to create a little bit of a smoother ramp here, so I'm just sanding it down so it's a little bit more of a better transition. Now that herringbone driveway can then just glue in place. And put a little bit of filler down to hold it in place, and then cover it with some masking tape and clamp it in place until it properly sets. Just try the house out here now. Now I must admit I have lost all the pieces of footage that shows the I'm wobbling the tripod, that shows the creation of the drain pipes, and I'm going to cover that in another video and a little bit later on. Those steps in front of it were made from some Foamex pieces just cut and set into the ground. For this next stage I'm just going to paint some neat PVA all over that brown paint that I've put down. Now this is my ground cover. I'm going to paint some gravel in here. So we're following the shape of the pathway and then the gravel that goes all the way around the house. So just need to be a bit neat with the glue, but just paint right up to the edge of the walls. Now after this has been done, I can just cover that with some grout mix. And while that's waiting to dry, I'm going to make some little walls for the edge of the garden. First thing I'm going to do is cover them with a light covering of grey wash. Now this is just so I can see the scribing in a bit better detail, or a bit clearer, because it's white on white, and in my evening light it's not that easy to see. So once that's covered with the grey wash and dried, I can then go over with the scribing tool and just carve in the details of the stone wall. With all the carving done, I can now add some colour to it. Giving it a dark grey wash again, and I'm going to add some greens. and just wash over that very wet. Use a hairdryer to speed the process up. Going wet on wet here, just to get that nice transition between the greens. And then once all that's done, I can super glue the edges, and I'm going to fix that to the edge of that garden area and onto the side of the road. It can just be glued in place quite nicely with some super glue. The next stage is to add some more Foamex strip. This I've cut into a piece that matches the curve of the wall using a template, and I'm going to glue that in place again with super glue. This is glued directly down to the MFC piece. And as with the roadway, I can just cover up a few of the gaps with some filler. Then moving to the ground cover, I'm just soaking that with some isopropyl alcohol. That reduces the surface tension and allows you to drop in some diluted PVA. And then going back to the ground cover, I'm just going to paint the base with some raw umber. That's going to give the grass a bit of a background in case there's any patches missing when I come to put the grass down. And back to the herringbone driveway, I'm just going to embellish those stones, or to accentuate those stones, with a dark brown wash. As you can see, that just really brings out those details between each stone. The roadway then receives a coating of lighter grey. I'm going to paint that onto both the road and the pavement. Once that's completely covered, I can then go over with a darker grey wash to give it a bit more tone. This may seem strange now. I'm not going to put it in the oven, but I'm just going to wrap it with silver foil just to protect all the windows from static grass when it comes to the application. Like the name suggests, it's very static and it does tend to stick to acrylic windows or acetate windows. So I'm going to paint all the areas that I want grass putting on with some neat PVA, and then once that's done, I'm going to use my trusty static grass applicator and fill it with some 2mm long strands of static grass. I use the word static grass quite a lot here. I'm going to completely cover every area that we want grass applying to. Once all that's down, I can then take off the silver foil. The next stage now is to go and make some plants. For this, I'm going to use some coconut fibre. I've covered making ivy with some coconut fibre in a previous video. What I'm going to do is cover that with some PVA that's been mixed with some light brown paint just to give it a bit more colour. I'm going to cover that with my flocking material, and I'm going to glue this with some super glue to the edge of the wall here to represent some climbing plants. I'm just going to speed through the rest of the foliage here. I've covered these in previous videos. I'll put a link up in the corner so you can see how I've done that in the past. Basically, it's just flock foliage mounted onto bits of seafoam for armatures and bits of heavier foliage as well. And once that's down, it's time to turn attention to the road. Again, I'm going to dry brush that with a lighter grey, and then to create the road markings, it's just a matter of putting down some masking tape to create the shape that we want, and then painting in with some bright white paint. At this point, attention can then turn back to the gravel. I'm going to cover that with some dark brown wash and then some black wash. I forgot to paint the door there, so I'm just painting it green. I'm going to put in a little tree there, created in the same way. That's just going to finish off the rest of the garden. Drilled a hole for the trunk to stick into, and I'm just going to place that in there with a bit of super glue. And then one final tree, just drill a hole where it's roughly going to go. Where it is going to go, because it can't roughly go somewhere, it's going to go in there. Just drill a hole in there and then plant it in place. Pardon the pun. And there you have it, that's the finished model. And if you've stayed with me so far for all this time, I thank you very much. It has been a long video. And if you have liked the video, I'd like to ask you to like, subscribe, and perhaps leave a comment. Let me know what you think. There'll be more tutorials to follow, probably some shorter videos than this, but more builds to follow as well. I've got a lot more pipelined into the future. That's not really a way of saying it, is it? Pipelined? I've got a lot more in the pipeline. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again in the next one.